In the 2010s, virtual reality burst into our living rooms, or at least some of our living rooms, and more recently on headsets that you can bring just about anywhere. Early games like Beat Saber, Arizona Sunshine, and Job Simulator gave us a peek at the possibilities of the tech. There have been VR versions of games like Superhot and Tetris Effect, VR-friendly updates to games like No Man's Sky and Skyrim. Sony got in on the game with not one but two VR headsets, and in 2020, the same week that the world went into a global lockdown, Valve released Half-Life Alyx, a game that pushed the boundaries of VR on the private company's second VR headset. Virtual reality has been part of the gaming landscape for well over a decade now, but in many ways it does still seem like adoption has been sluggish. Hello and welcome to Dear Dwyery. I'm your host, Danny O'Dwyer. I feel like you can gauge an idea of somebody's interest in VR by if they own a headset or not, so allow me to come clean. My first was a HTC Vive, the one that Valve initially sold. I've since given that one to a friend. I own both versions of PlayStation's headsets. I have a Valve Index, that's what I played Half-Life Alyx on, and recently I came into ownership of a Meta Quest 3, Meta's latest headset that supports tech including inside-out tracking, which means it has no wires, and hand tracking. More on that later. In fact, I came into it because the company that today's interviewee is CEO of sent it to me so I could do a demo of their latest game, Dimensional Double Shift, a title none of my other headsets would support because of said inside-out tracking. Full disclosure, I assumed I was going to be sending this headset back, but it appears they sent me one from Amazon. But as you know, we don't actually take handouts from the games industry here at NoClip, so to reset my karma in the wasteland, I'm donating the cost of the headset, about $499.99, to an organization supplying relief to Palestine and southern Lebanon. Gaming is my most expensive pastime, but like many of you who forego fancy cars, fashion and jewelry to focus your discretionary income on video games, VR stretches the limits of that relationship. There are many reasons for that: the quality and number of games, compatibility issues, how long you want to spend setting it up, how long you want to spend with a piece of technology strapped to your face, and of course, the cost. But there's no denying that some of my favorite gaming experiences of recent memory happened with a pair of goggles strapped to my head. The start, middle and end of Half-Life Alyx, introducing my daughter to Job Simulator and playing co-op Rec Room with her, and recently I played dozens of courses in walkabout mini-golf in various hotel rooms around the world while I was on the road filming for a month. When VR works, it really does work, and I've wanted to do a check-in on the industry for quite a while, so to do that I invited Andrew Eiche from Owlchemy Labs. I've played a lot of Owlchemy's games over the years, initially on my own and more recently with my daughter. They're the studio behind Job Simulator, Vacation Simulator, Rick and Morty Virtual Rickality, Cosmonious High, and their recently announced Dimensional Double Shift. Andrew has been in and around VR games since that initial 2010s boom, so we sat down to talk about how the space has evolved, the current rate of travel, how Owlchemy's games have evolved with those times, and what to expect in the not too distant future. Andrew, thank you so much for talking to us. One question I want to ask you, as somebody who's been super plugged into VR for quite a while now, is VR in 2024 kind of where you thought it would have been when you first started working on this technology? Is it behind? Is it ahead? Is it kind of in the window?
I think it's actually ahead. To give you a sense, right? We started VR, and it was, you had to hang stuff on your walls, right? It was the lighthouses, right? Which were incredible at the time, because, I had worked with people who'd done projects on custom motion capture rigs in their home, and they were hanging 16 or 20 cameras, and they were wearing suits with balls in it, and suddenly you can capture at the same precision with just these two things on your walls. So anyway, those things on your walls, that's 2016, that's, 8 years ago, right?
Right.
And we had predicted that, it'll be about, a decade, maybe a little less, before we get, inside-out tracking, right? And it runs like an iPad. We're just going to be in this state for a long time. And it happened so fast, right? And I think that, we become a little bit, maybe used to VR. But to tell you how far VR has even come in our industry is, those shitty mailers you get in the mail, and they're here's a value pack, 1 million ads or whatever, right? On the back of it, it was there was a home, buy a home, and it had a picture of a VR headset, and it said VR headset preferred on the QR code. And I was like, that's where we are, right? They don't have to explain what a VR headset is. They don't have to do anything. It's just like in a QR code on the back of like the cheapest mailer you've ever seen. Right. And it's like, yeah, VR, this thing we all know exists and many of us have. We would prefer you use this to check out these homes, right?
That's amazing. So it's like the litmus test for like social penetration. Is this like terrible little mailer that your grandma's going to get has just assumes you know what a VR headset is and what a QR code works.
Yeah, it just said like VR headset preferred. Yeah, and I go to CES frequently, and I always like walk around, and I'm trying to see what booths that aren't VR focused have VR. That's always amazing. I saw one like ADT, the security company, was like, "We'll outsource your security guards." No, I don't say that's a good idea. Like, I'm not promoting that, but it's interesting that they're like that the headsets are pushing that far out. So for me personally, right? Like, I definitely saw this, kind of gaming and this really interesting community, but I think that it was very easy in the early days to look at the investment and go like, oh my God, we're going to make all the money and it's the empathy magic machine and it's going to change the world. And it was like, no, it's like a really cool new media, and like all new media, we got to figure it out, right? It took how long to figure out film, how long to figure out any of these. So, yeah.
We'll go back and talk about a lot of Owlchemy's work over the years, especially because there's so many great games that I'm very excited to talk to you about. But just on the sort of like how fast it's developed over the past 10 years, where do you think that's coming from? It seems like there's been a lot of investment in VR from some very big tech companies is probably one thing. Is that where it's coming from? Is it developers, designers, engineers understanding it more and sort of getting comfortable with pushing at the boundaries? Where do you think that's coming from?
I mean, yes to kind of all those, right? I think we'd be remiss to say that like, yeah, Meta has poured a ton of money into this, right? And they've really pushed the ecosystem further than it could have just like organically, whatever that means, grown, right?
Breaking news today, Facebook just announced it will acquire Oculus VR, creator of the much-hyped virtual reality tech Oculus Rift. Facebook will pay $2 billion. Facebook founder and CEO...
And so that's helpful. The additional helpful thing is that, yeah, you have a bunch of passionate, committed developers, right, who were willing to stay in it and willing to find and fight for what this media is. And then on top of that, there's a group of players, right? We'd be remiss to leave them out, who truly believe in VR, right? And truly, like, Gorilla Tag is a great example of a game that, like, couldn't exist anywhere else, right? It has to be on this particular headset in this particular way. I think it's kind of like a perfect storm of all three of those things, right? You have the actual people using it, you have the people making stuff for it, and then you have the people developing, and then those kind of all coalescing into an easier to use and singular format has been really great for the ecosystem.
I want to talk about that audience especially in a little bit, but let's take a step backwards first. So tell us a little bit about Owlchemy Labs, like how it was founded and when you joined and what projects you worked on when you first joined.
So Owlchemy Labs was originally founded by Alex Schwartz and Devin Reimer. It was a mobile game company, right? They made these games, Jack Lumber. They made a game called Smuggle Truck, which got in trouble on the App Store and became Snuggle Truck.
Snuggle Truck, I remember.
Right, that's kind of like the Owlchemy DNA infamous, we have a little problem with authority. And and so they were working on those games. In parallel, I was at some other companies, right? And I had met up with Devin and Alex a number of times. And so, VR happens, right? And they make this game, like they take this game and they port it to VR. They do Cardboard and they do Oculus, right? And these games are like wildly popular, and that allows them, that opens the door where Valve's like, okay, you kind of know some stuff about this, you should come check out this thing we're doing, which at the time was the precursor to what would become the HTC Vive. And so they take that and they go into like Winnipeg, right, where Devin lives. The four people who were the original four meet up, and they find out that like stacking blocks is like this really cool and fun thing, and then like touching things and interacting with things. And so eventually they end up moving from that into like what would be funny, and be like, oh, it's funny if you do a job. And it was Owlchemy's first 3D game, so it was like, we can't animate, we don't know how to animate, so what if like they were like giant computer screens, right? I can animate a cube, right? I can't do like a character walking around. It's really hard to figure out. And from there, it blew up, right? They had this big demo in 2015 at GDC. And sometime in there, they asked me to come on board. They actually originally asked me to come on board. They were like, hey, we have this. Have you ever heard of Rick and Morty? We need someone to lead that project while we finish this one, right? And that's always like your aspirations. But I was the 11th person to join, and I showed up and helped them finish Job Simulator. So I worked a lot of like, where I was supposed to be a producer, but I ended up coding a lot. And so it was a lot of the, the garage was a big thing that I helped with, and then a few other things. And then so helped ship that, ran the Rick and Morty project. And then we did Vacation Simulator after that. And at that time, Alex left the company. I became CTO, which switched to COO because Devin was the like super tech genius, and it was kind of silly and didn't make sense to have a CTO who was like, hey, what's going on with tech? I know a lot about the tech, but I wasn't like Devin. And then a year ago, Devin left and he went and started his own thing. So yeah, and then I took over from there.
Excellent. So you were coming in at the end of Job Simulator.
Hello, human. Welcome to an accurate simulation of office worker.
I absolutely adore Job Simulator and Vacation Simulator, and it's become a generational thing now in this house because my daughter just turned 6. She doesn't really pick up and play controllers much at all. She hasn't much interest in it, but she really enjoys doing virtual reality, and her favorite game is Vacation Simulator. Job Simulator to me seemed like it's very funny to hear that it was based like having floating robots means you don't have to animate them walking, like stuff like that.
Yeah,
very smart economical game design. But one of the things that I always thought seemed really unfair when it came to VR is like everyone has to port to different, consoles and hardware architectures and stuff. But just how difficult is it, especially back then, probably before there was like a lot of like, cross-platform tools or whatever. How tricky was it to like put Job Simulator out on, the Oculus headset, the HTC Vive, PlayStation VR, like all that stuff?
So Oculus and HTC Vive were pretty parity, right?
Oh, cool.
It was, you got a PC, right? We had a little bit of a different runtime, and we built this layer called Owlchemy VR, and it like translated it. So that was nice. PlayStation was like, we were like, this is the hardest thing at the time. We were like, this is the hardest thing we've ever done, right? And remember, PlayStation VR 1, it was really kind of a Frankenstein machine, right? It was using the controllers that weren't built for VR to try to get VR out of it, right? And the headset to try to track with a lower resolution camera. And they did this like wonderful job making it all work and seem like it was all correct by intent. Right. But it was like definitely something where they had real interest in VR, but didn't necessarily think about that when they architected a PS4. And so, we got it working that. And we were like, okay, that's the hardest thing ever. And then Meta goes, hey, we have this headset and it's the Meta Quest. And oh, by the way, it's like a phone, but you have to render twice, like once in each eye. And that was one of the hardest things we've ever done, right? It's like porting PC to PC is difficult. Porting PC to console is pretty difficult. Porting from PC to the headset is extremely hard because we had built this game thinking like, oh yeah, we have an NVIDIA graphics card and we have all this stuff. And then suddenly it's like, yeah, you have this one chip that's made by Qualcomm and it kind of does some of the things you want it to. And by the way, you're running Unity and you're running like an experimental version and you're building basically an Android application to run. Right. And so, yeah, we did there's like all sorts of weird tricks, and I won't get like super duper technical, but I can explain. Like we had to in Vacation Simulator, we had to like the butterflies don't technically animate; they're like a shader that like tricks you into thing, and then like things turn on and off in that game like crazy. So like if the physics aren't going, we like switch to a static version. So like there's like these like lanterns and you can like whap them and they like move and it's all nice. And then when they're not moving, we're like, psh. It's like somebody behind the scenes is quickly tearing everything down and putting up paper mache versions as fast as they can.
And presumably a lot of that is even tougher for you guys in the VR space because not having latency and not having, animations hiccup or slow down and stuff is absolutely essential.
Yeah. If you miss frame rate, people start barfing, right? If you complain, right, like you're making a game for Switch and you're like, oh yeah, we have this one part and it's got a lot of particles and a bunch of other like effects and we kind of dip down to 15 frames a second, but like everybody we just sit tight. We hold on and we roll with it. If you do that in VR, it's like everybody buckles over, everybody gets sick, right? It doesn't, there's very few, no matter how good you are at motion sickness, there's very few humans who can handle like low frame rate because something in your brain goes like, I have absolutely been poisoned. There is no reason why the world should look like this. It is time to purge. And so, you just go into like pure throw up mode. So it's we have to hit those. And the Quest one was like 72 frames per second and on mobile. And we're,
in two eyes as well, right? Isn't it?
Two eyes, and a lot of the fun things that you get on PC were gone. But, kind of a fun thing that happened because of that, right, is so we did all that work and we were like, okay. And then Valve goes, hey, we got this index. Like, you should check this out. And we're like, oh, we can run at 120. Because, like, we had built this thing to run at 72 on, like, a little puny headset. So we were able to run at the super high frame rate on the index. No problem. Which was super fun to do. So
amazing. You'd become optimization masters by that stage.
Yeah. If there is a mastery of optimization, I'm not convinced. I think optimization is like this thing you just whittle away at forever, and eventually you just like reach your goal, but you're not sure if you did enough work. You just kind of chip away.
Cross your fingers and hope no one barfs.
Pretty much every time, every game.
So Vacation Simulator then, is people who haven't played it, I think, might just assume, it's like the job simulator thing. You you go in, it transports you in, and you do a bunch of distinct jobs, and then you eat a burrito and you go back to the menu. But it's a totally different design of a game. Like it's open. You're exploring those areas yourself. Even the areas that you're in, you're not standing in one place. You're walking around the beach. You're walking around the forest, whatever it is. Tell us a little bit about, were you involved in the design of that at all? And
yes.
What did it do? I guess from both the design and a hardware perspective, how was that an evolution on Job Simulator?
So, I mean, when we made Job Simulator, we actually didn't know if fading to black would work, right? So there was an original version of Job Simulator where like this big like pod consumed you and then you went to the job because we didn't like you got to think about it, right? Like film, right? They didn't know if cutting would work, so they just filmed stages. And then later on, they had to figure out the whole like persistence of motion stuff and like, okay, we can actually like cut the film and people will get what's happening. It was the same thing at that stage, so we didn't know. So we did Job Sim, and then we want to kind of approach what an open world would feel like in VR, right? And a lot of what we subscribe to at Owlchemy is that we subscribe to this thing called VR of the near. And it's basically that VR is interesting when you go to cool places, but it's most interesting when everything within arm's reach is like rich, interactable, and like acknowledges the affordances that you expect of it.
Okay.
And so our game in many ways is open world, but when you think of a 2D game, a lot of what 2D games are banking on from an exploration design perspective is traversal is fun, right? I get on horseback, or I, swing through a city, or name your paradigm, right? You jump into a bale of hay, right? And that traversal is inherently something you enjoy. And in VR, traversal isn't that fun. Like even the people who are like, I have the iron stomachs, it's like the point of the game is not moving around, right? With the exception of like 2 games, and those are for like real fighter pilots, right? Or Gorilla Tag, right? Where it's like novel, like the actual locomotion is weird and novel. In our games, we were like, okay, if you're not trying to use like exploring the physical geography of a space as what exploration is, what is it? And it's more like going to like sneaking in your parents' office and rummaging through their desk. Right? Yeah. That's our version of exploration in VR. It's like this compressed space where you have as much exploration as you would if you were riding across a plane, right? But the plane doesn't have a lot of stuff, right? It's that movement. Instead, it's like there's a ton of stuff. You're just not in a huge expands. And so that's a lot of what Vacation Simulator was. It was also the first game where you could actually transfer items between spaces. So there was a lot of like, we had to make pancakes work for every single item. We had to make waffles work for we had like all these like scenes that tested waffling every single item. And so, yeah, it was just like this exponentially more complex game, but it was really interesting to us because it was also, you know, what happens if we just open the game up? And you know, one of the big things we wanted was like no loading screens. That's why there's this like enormous loading screen in the front of the game. And then, but then once you're in, right, you could jump between any area at any time, and there's no loading screens.
I'm very fascinated in what the sort of moment-to-moment enjoyment is from a design perspective, because games for the longest time, you know, I feel like in VR at least, like at the start, there was a lot of novelty, right? There was a lot of like, oh, this is crazy. I've never seen this before. But it's been, you know, 10 years since I played Job Simulator. And if I jump into it now, maybe it doesn't give me the sort of the wow of the experience of using VR, but the mechanics of playing the game are still really interesting. And essentially all you're doing is like picking up objects and moving them and playing and things like that. And games, I feel like historically at least, were about, you know, defeating incoming alien invasions or, you know, doing things that you know, maybe couldn't do in real life or that were impressive. And that's still a lot of what games are about. So what is it that makes these games enjoyable, do you think, given now that much of the novelty, and we'll talk about your new game and the new tech that's involved there, but a large amount of the novelty of these games is gone, but there's so much enjoyment in essentially doing things that you might do in the real world every day, picking objects up and sorting things and using your eyes to figure out puzzles.
So I've thought about this a lot. So it's role-playing. And in kind of the flat games, a lot of what you're talking about is playing a game and doing these fantastical things, right? But in VR, the joy there is it is so much about you existing in the space that you get to become the whatever it is you're doing, right? And one of the big things I think VR has had to overcome is its tendency to try to recreate what has existed in flat screen that works wonderfully, right? These like narrative driven rich games where it's like, you know, you are Lara Croft, right?
Right.
You are Nathan Drake, right? You pick who you are, right? And then you follow this story. That doesn't work as well in VR. It works as well as like you are you, but you are in the Museum of Job, right? Or you are able to use a hammer to swing across a bridge, or you have lightsabers and get to cut blocks. And it's that true, like, actual role playing that really, really works. And we use this all the time at Owlchemy. Is like, you know, we're shocked by how frequently people play Job Simulator, right?
Right.
Like, this is a small team of developers at a very early stage in VR. And same with Vacation Simulator, where we still weren't huge or anything. We're still not huge, right? But it's still a small group of people making this game, and we look back on it and we're like, why do people keep coming back, right? Because all the things that you look at in games, right, is like, there's a big goal, right? Go kill Ganon, right? One of these big things. And it doesn't exist necessarily in some of the most popular VR titles. And a lot of it is because people want to be something and you want to role play. And I think VR harkens back to some of the truest role playing. And some of the more intricate things that just wouldn't be interesting in a flat screen, right? Like when you're saying, oh, you're doing things that you could do in real life, my counterpoint is like, go walk behind the counter of a 7-Eleven and see how fast that experience ends for you, right? But you get to do it, right? It's like we're almost permitting everybody to go to one of those like Discovery Zone or like little kids, like the children's museums,
right?
But anybody can go and you can just play with it. Oh, and by the way, it has fire and the fire works, right? Or it has this and this works, and you can do it all and you get to role play. And so then a lot of in Vacation Simulator is a great example because Job Sim is easier to picture, but Vacation Simulator is like, we would always ask ourselves, what is the quintessential X, right? What is the quintessential camping vacation have to make you feel like you're role playing? oh, it has to have fishing, it has to have kayaking, it has to have s'mores, it has to have a hike. We had to come up with what a hike was in a game that we didn't want to have locomotion, right? And so that we came up with this like teleporting colossal cave style maze, and we're like, okay, that's how it works, right? But it's that boiling it down to that, like, you want to feel like you're doing this, and we can, at that point, you don't need fantastical. Mundane works just fine.
I'm very conscious as like a new enough father. My daughter's 6 years old. I guess I'm not that new a father, but I'm very conscious of trying to just immediately prescribe my personal experience onto other things. But there definitely seems to be some element of childlike play that I have seen sort of activated in myself, I guess, when I'm playing these games. And also now that, I've done some online, like Rec Room I've done with my daughter as well, right? And when we play in Rec Room, we play the same as when we play upstairs in her room, like where I am on the ground with her and we are equal and we are playing and we are being silly and having fun and stuff like that. How much of VR, especially in your guys' games, is sort of, leaning into, I don't know, allowing adults to be silly and
like
play?
It's 100%, right? Our whole thing is, when we made Vacation Simulator, we play tested it, and we had the like you get into this like lounge area, right? Your like hotel room, and people were just like goofing off in the bathtub and stuff, and we were like, we kept optimizing it to be like, get the fuck out of here, like go, you got a game to play. And then we all like had this moment. It was like an epiphany that this like high level design team had all at once, and it was, why are we doing this? Right. If people are having fun with our game, get out of their way. And so a lot of what we do, and a lot of the like systemic hell that we live in, is we build these systems and we build them for you to have fun, and we try to get the hell out of your way. Right. And we want you to have that playful fun, and we want you to do that. And we think VR is one of those environments where folks feel safe being playful. And like, if you think about some of people's most memorable moments in all of gaming, right? VR aside, some of the greatest moments are just people doing silly things that are adjacent to the game, right? Actually having moments of joy, actually having moments of fun. And so we like really, really focus on that, and we really focus on how to create the space. And our next game's multiplayer, so we spent a lot of time on like how to create silly interactions, and we have this like hierarchy of jokes thing, and the number one is like jokes that the players create themselves or between each other.
Right.
That's the big thing, is like, we don't need you to hear our stand-up routine. We'll get out of your way. If you got fun inside jokes, like, have at it.
Yeah. The game that I feel like leans into at least the childhood nature in a more sort of explicit way is Cosmonious High, which basically has you playing as a child.
Looks like the new kid's getting a crash course.
In a way, it's sort of like a smaller experience, well, kind of, than Vacation Simulator is, a bit more structured. But what was the I guess, design source of this game?
We want to explore character and really what it meant to be part of character. I think like the way that we had done our games, right, is we had done Job Simulator, and then we did Rick and Morty, and we got to explore character a little bit in Rick and Morty, and it was really fun. And then we did Vacation Simulator, and if you notice, Vacation Simulator, every bot at a different station is like a different bot. They're all kind of ephemeral. You can kind of swap them out. There are like, I wrote a lot of the script of that, so there are like all these backstories, but like you'd have to really dig to find them. And then we got to do, so we always do kind of like an expansion pack. So we did this expansion pack called Back to Job, and we were like, oh man, we like this stuff. And so yeah, with Cosmonious, it was like, we want to do a high school. We knew that. And we were like, what's a big part of high school? And we're like, the biggest part is like friends. Mm-hmm. And so we're like, how do we get you into this setting? Which is why we did like this whole emoji talking thing, right? How do we get you in this setting? How do we get you talking with friends and really see what that's like to have these like extremely detailed, somewhat, realistic, if you could say that, characters, and have them bantering and all that stuff. And so, yeah, it's more focused because we have a lot more like dialogue and characters talking to each other. But at the same time, in some ways it's like smaller than Vacation Sim in some ways is way bigger because we have like these like crazy tech things we did where we're like, let's make fluids. Like we always joked about splashing a martini in someone's face, and we're like, we can never do that. And then in Cosmo, we were like, we could do it.
Yeah, all the physics stuff. I mean, it leans into the sci-fi nature of, I think, the setup as well. Is that it very much feels like the calamitous science experiment class kind of vibe to it. What were some of the big learnings you took away from that project then? Was there stuff that you were really excited about leaning into, and was there other things that maybe that game didn't have that the previous games did, or do they appeal to different audiences perhaps? Or
they definitely appeal to different audiences a bit. I think Cosmo, we learned a ton about characters and a ton about writing and story and some stuff. I think, taking a critical look at it, right, we would have loved to inject a little bit stronger conflict into it. I think the conflict, it just doesn't land as cleanly as it could, right? It feels like the stakes are very low, right? And we would have loved to make the stakes a little bit, like raise the stakes a little bit in that game. And then, there's always like the crazy thought where you're like, what if we had put it in a junior college instead? Could we have been a little edgier with it?
Right.
Because like we were always a little hands, like we always touched it gently because it was like, you'd be like, oh, well, what if this kid falls on his face? And you're like, it's a kid. Like, everyone slow down here. So but that's like kind of the what ifs you do after any project. Cosmonious High is like this wonderful game. And everyone who plays it, it's like one of our most highly rated from people who play it. They really fall in love with it. It's not as popular as our other games. And I think some of that is due to, the audience of VR and the audience of Cosmonious High are not necessarily like as aligned as they perfectly could be.
it also came out on just an insane number of headsets as well. Has that job gotten easier or tougher? Because there's probably more platforms, but is there?
It ebbs and flows, right? So it was like really hard when everyone had a different control scheme, right? Because HTC Vive was like, we got a touchpad, and then somebody's like, we got a joystick, and then Valve was like, well, what if we also threw in this thing that like half tracked your hands, but not really, and it straps to your hands. It's called the Knuckles. It also has a trackpad, right? And so it like that went on and on and on, and so it got a little easier when you think about like, oh, we have Android as a platform, right? And so you're like, okay, now we make basically Steam, Meta, and we make Pico, and Meta and Pico are Android. Okay, got it. And then and then Apple shows up, and so now we're back. Yes. So now it's hard again. So now it's like, okay. So we have to do everything a few different times, right? Before it was like, oh, we have 3 major platforms: PC, PlayStation, and general Android. And now it's like, oh, and Apple, by the way, which requires specialized hardware and all this other stuff to make it.
Introducing Apple Vision Pro. Vision Pro is a new kind of computer that augments reality by seamlessly blending the real world with the digital world.
Yeah, I'm sure you can't get into like the nuts and bolts of some of this stuff, but I am very interested in the business realities of these as well, because unlike, a somewhat open platform like PC, right? There are so many games available on a PC that the developers of PCs don't have any need to incentivize people to buy PCs or consoles or just about anything like that. And there was a time for almost all platforms that is the case. But obviously, when it comes to virtual reality, there's always an incentive for each of these new, especially when it's a new, discreetly new headset, to make sure that the sort of best and brightest that exist are on their platform as well, and that there are future titles that are taking advantage maybe of new technology that they're also doing it as well. So is it like, I imagine the business of running a company involved in VR is very all over the place in terms of who you're talking to, partner platforms, deals over here, or less discreet stuff like here's a sequel, we're remastering this for a new thing. What's it like, I guess? Is there a lot of that? Is there a lot of like, oh, here's a new headset from Apple, here's a deal to get our old games on it, how does all that stuff sort of work? Do you have to be really on top of it to make sure that you're getting the right deals on the right platforms?
I mean, you have to be really on top of like the current state of tech. I spend a good chunk of my time making sure they understand where the headsets are and who's coming down the pipeline and those kind of things. And then a lot of it is, we've made some smart moves to like separate the layers of our tech so that the platform layer exists a little bit independent of the game stuff, and we run on Unity, so that helps too. But a lot of it is, the deals are actually not the hardest part. If I had to be honest, right? Going and talking to those folks, and it's a little bit callous for me to say that because we have Job Simulator and Vacation Simulator, so people show up and they talk to us.
Right.
But the harder part then is, you're given a piece of hardware, right? And this is completely universal. Is no one does this well because they can't. You're given a piece of hardware, and the only documentation exists in the engineer's mind of the private forum you have access to. And so it's like you and like Unity and like headset manufacturer X.
Right.
And you have a bunch of emails, and sometimes you have a shared Slack or a forum, and you kind of send messages, and then any one of those groups of people might go dark for a while for any number of reasons, right? Like Unity could go dark because they're like, oh, by the way, it's a holiday in Denmark. See ya. And you're like, okay, well, it's not a holiday here. We still have to work. So yeah, it's there's always this kind of shuffle. So we found that like being very open and being very, very good about those partners and contributing and we try to pick bugs that we complain about that make things better for everyone.
Right.
So we're like, hey, this is broken and it's broken for, and the ones where we're like, this is just us because we did something stupid. We go in and we kind of scrub that over ourselves. But yeah, there's a lot of like careful ballet for the whole thing. And yeah, the deal side is normally like, it's complex, but it's the more straightforward part. It's okay, we made the deal. Now here's a date in the future that you have to have this whole thing done by. And you're
right.
Like, oh no.
I remember seeing videos of, I believe it was one of your co-founders doing a talk at GDC about the original version of the HTC Vive that would electrocute you if you took it off.
Lightly, yeah. There was and there was like a version that had a belt on it.
Belt,
right? Because it had the you had to like strap the cable. The controllers went all the way through the cable back to the computer. They weren't wireless at the time.
Oh, wow.
And so you put on a belt to make sure that you didn't like get the wires tangled in you. When they first got the first headset, Valve sent it to them and they sent a bunch of 3D printer files, right? And this was before like 3D printing was big. And they were like, what the fuck is this? Like, what are these files? And then Valve's like, oh yeah, you just got to print them. And they're like, we don't have 3D printers. And they're like, oh shit, okay, we'll send you those things. Like,
what were they printing? Was it
it was like the brackets for the lighthouses, like the original lighthouses. Like they're like, yeah, and then you just print this because like shipping costs, right? So print this bracket and just put it up on your wall. And it was like, I'm sorry, what?
Having done some work with Valve over the years, that is a very Valve thing to do. Yeah,
and then, but they were totally cool about it. They were like, oh, okay, so we're sorry. Like here's the 3D printed files. You're good to go. Yeah. So yeah, it's we were early days on some of those. There was a headset that like, to get it to stop tracking, you had to like put it in a bag and shake it, like the angry bag, and you're like, stop it headset. So yeah, there's always some pretty good like engineering sample stuff. It's funny now. It's not funny when you're like shaking a bag for your 100th time. Like,
right.
Please just work.
Obviously, a big factor when it comes to all this stuff, whether it be the deals or just where you're going to put resources in terms of the team, is the market share for each of these headsets as well. Like, how much does that play into it? Because it must be especially tricky when like so much of these pieces of hardware are or have been at one point a new piece of tech, an emerging, like the Apple headset, of course, is an example of this, where you're like, well, how much do we put into this when right now no one has it, before it comes out, and then when it comes out, you're thinking about how many people are going to be on there. So I guess, yeah, like I kind of have two questions about market. One is, how much does that fluctuate, and how has the VR market been over the past 10 years? Has it grown much? Has it changed maybe with demographics and stuff?
So on the market as a whole, the market has absolutely grown, right? It's enormous growth. The past few years, I wouldn't say are like, it's not like a linear, it's not some magic hockey stick chart that somebody wants to see. It is growing, right? Every year it's growing. Every year, at least from what we see it as still in continued growth, right? And the big jump being when we switched to 6, in the internal tracking, right? The Quest and kind of the headsets that have followed in that line. Yeah, and it's not shocked to anybody. Like, there's most headsets out there are Quests, right? That's Quest 2 is like the largest thing. Does that factor into how we develop? Yeah, but not in as meaningful a way as I think folks would think. We're in it to be multi-platform, right? We want the medium to succeed. And so a lot of the way that we do things is we try to be smart about it, right? So that's why Job Sim, Vacation Sim are on everything, right? We're taking our most popular titles and we're saying, okay, like, it's worth the effort, regardless of the number of players, to show our support as Owlchemy Labs to say, like, hey, you all can follow us and see, here's our game that we made, and we made it work, right? And in the case of like Apple Vision, for instance, it was like, here's our game that we made that was made using controllers. Here it is now not using controllers. This is the way that you can do this. And so some of that is like we do that out of pure leadership, and then some of it is you're trying to like predict, right? Apple Vision's an interesting one, right? Because it's a newer headset, so there's not like a ton of people, but there's like a ton of mind share for it. So, anytime we do a talk on it or anything, like, the room is packed. So yeah, it's all trying to predict the kind of trying to predict the future and read the tea leaves. And a lot of just our philosophy here is like, we don't pick winners, right? We just show up on, every platform we can that supports the base set of technology that we built into the game, and whoever wins, right? And then we're on that platform.
Has the age profile changed as well? I just think when I look at like the Quest 2 and the Quest 3 as well, they are so much easier to use for a non-hardcore gamer crowd. Even the PSVR 2 can be tricky to use, and certainly the Vive, and I set it up for my daughter, and then she gets herself, twisted up in the cable every single time. Have those meta headsets sort of changed the game in terms of who's using VR as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both anecdotally and practically, right? Anecdotally, I went to visit a friend recently, and she's like, I have a MetaQuest 2, and she's like she was a project manager at Northwestern Mutual, right? Okay. So this is like,
she's not playing Elden Ring on the weekend,
Yeah, like her, her partner's a gamer and like plays a lot of games. She like uses it to play, like, to do fitness stuff, right? And that's a huge thing. And I think that we, as coming from the game side, we always forget that, a good chunk of the Quest users, and then also we see a lot of the youth side of things, right? Enormously so, right? It's like, I think that the shock that's going to happen to the system is once the group of young, players gets enough money that they have their own independent cash, right? I think what you're seeing now is, right, the Quest goes down to 10, so that's all I'll talk about. But what you're seeing between, 10-year-old and 17-year-olds, you're going to watch that generation age up. I think you're seeing like the Atari generation, if you really want to put it as that, which is like, there was a group of people who grew up and video games didn't exist. And it is this abstract thing that they either accept or don't accept. And a group of people who grew up with it, and it is like a fact of life. And I think in what I see is, I see a lot of adults. We see a lot of adults, and a lot of adults enjoy it and play it and they engage with it. And then we see a lot of the young people being like really, really into it. And so you'll see, you kind of see that move. And the other thing too is, I think, right, like, it is accessible to non-hardcore. We don't make hardcore games, right? I'm not going to pretend like I'm out here trying to build games for the hardcore. I love when hardcore gamers play it, right? Like, personally, right, I play a number, and a lot of people at Owlchemy play a number of hardcore games. I'm not pretending to be necessarily the like perfect arbiter of target audience here myself, because like, what is it? My favorite gamers are Zachtronic games. So it's like, I'm out there. I'm like lost. I'm a lost soul in this, right? It's like, oh my gosh, he's coding for fun. He's, but, and I love those deep puzzle games and those kind of things. But at the same time, like, I appreciate it and I appreciate the community. And I think that like the point of our games is that everyone can play them, even if that's not the game that you would always like go to first thing, right? And then for a lot of people, it is absolutely the game they would absolutely go to first thing.
Owlchemy's latest game, Dimensional Double Shift, recently launched for free in early access beta. On the face of it, it's a sort of a co-op version of Job Simulator where you and up to 3 other friends perform manual labor for a hegemonic corporation in a hyper-capitalist future. But remarkably, it doesn't use any controllers. The game is entirely played through hand tracking. Hand tracking, along with inside-out tracking for the headset, has long been the holy grail of VR development. VR controllers are, at the end of the day, controllers with buttons and D-pads and thumbsticks. And while they can provide haptic feedback, in general they are cumbersome and ultimately designed to be forgotten about.
Let's talk about your new game, because it's a big shift for you guys in terms of it's a multiplayer game, as you said, and also it's utilizing the sort of latest mountain that VR has been climbing recently, which is hand tracking or digit tracking. Tell us about the game, and by the time this comes out, it will have been announced and out in some form, right?
Yes. The beta will be out for everyone to play. It's a free beta, so if you have a headset, go download it and check it out. If you have a Quest, because it's coming out for Quest 2, Quest 3, and Quest Pro. The name of the game is Dimensional Double Shift. You and your friends run a diner and a service station that has been selected to travel the Omniverse. And so you and your friends have to serve the various citizens of the Omniverse, ordering things or fixing these cars, these like space vehicles, burning stuff, blowing stuff up, whatever kind of chaos we normally inject. It's very collaborative, very multiplayer. And it's a big shift for us because of that multiplayer, completely hand-tracked gameplay.
Let's talk about the multiplayer first of all then, because obviously I talked about Rec Room earlier. It's a game that I've really enjoyed playing. Gorilla Tag has come up a bunch. There is a big social element in VR for sure that sort of persists. Which way have you sort of decided to take it? Because one of the things that I really enjoyed about playing the demo was that it felt very different to a game, for instance, like Rec Room, in that like half the time when I played this game, especially with my kid, when I play Rec Room with my daughter, we're just trying to find each other or stick together. Whereas in your game, you're sort of always at least in a little pod together. You might be moving around, but you're moving around as a group.
So we set out to make this like as collaborative a game as possible. And we did like this ton of experimentation to get there. And what we finally realized is multiplayer VR felt the best when you and your friends needed to work together. And so from that like seed, the whole game grows. And so we have these spaces, right? And like a big rule when you do multiplayer VR is never allow the players to put their hands in the same space as other players.
Oh,
because
funny.
Like lots of bad networking things happen. But we threw that out. And then we went and did it. And so it was like every time we did these collaborations, right? Where you're like, I need an ingredient from you, or I need you to help make this, or, in the garage, which is a little more puzzly, it's like the two of us need to work together. The game just like sang during those times. So we just like leaned as hard as we could into that. And then we started taking out anything that prevented that. Right. And so that's why it's like, hey, you're in your area, you're close to the person, you got your like space to move around in, but we don't want you shouting like, like, hey, come back over here. Like, why are you running away? Right. Keep you together and collaborating.
How do you, I guess, instill that type of collaboration in people? Because, folks will, presumably if you're playing with friends, you're going to do that. But how does the game mechanically force people perhaps to work together?
So there's like standard tricks, which is like when you're in the diner, we make sure that like a certain percentage of orders, a very high percentage of orders, require ingredients that you don't have access to. Then comes the next question, which is like, okay, but what if my friend's an asshole, right? But they're going to need an ingredient from you, right? So this is like old economics game theory, right? So it's like, you can't be a complete dick because it's going to come back around. So, it's like you need an ingredient from them, they need an ingredient from you. And then in the garage, it's like you all have your own sets of tools. So each person in the game is a specific role, right? It's like somebody's like the flapjacker. They can like make pancakes and do all this stuff. And so that's what they're focused on. But they might need an ingredient like, a tomato for some reason, right? And the tomato only grows in the gardener station. And so you have to have that. And that's that kind of rote collaboration. And then in the garage, being more puzzly, there's we do kind of two things. So we have the, you might need a tool from me, or I might need a tool from you. Or we have like corner puzzles or specific puzzles that are like, I have to pull a lever, then you have to do a thing over there, then I have to. And it's almost like this kind of coordinated task. And so those are like the sleight of hand tricks. And then on top of that, it's like we make sure you face each other. We don't let you compete against each other. We do all sorts of things to like try to also turn the temperature down and get you focused on your friends.
I find VR to be very most games, I guess, are fairly, if not goal oriented, then at least they are giving you access to new things or helping you improve your character by way of doing things. But VR games don't necessarily have that sort of one-to-one relationship. In Job Simulator, there was a joy in finishing the job, of course. Vacation Simulator, you were collecting all these memories and getting access to new things by virtue of doing that. But when I was playing Dimensional Double Shift, and when at the start it felt like something like Quick Talking and Nobody Explodes, maybe, where it's a game where like you were having to work together, but there was a very distinct fail state in that game. In your game, how do you instill that type of we are working together while not necessarily pressurizing the players? Yeah.
So some of that is just natural, right? Like humans have a natural, so we kind of lay the carrot out. So you do get rewards at the end. I mean, that's not the most, it's not the point. It is a very important point of the game, but it's not like you're going to get these rewards. It's like you get these really cool cosmetics that you get to show off, and you get these really cool titles. But in the moment to moment game, we present you with a problem, and like it only takes one person. As long as you have one person in the group who's like, I can't leave like a thing unbroken or like a mess on the floor, right. The rest just falls into line, right? The external pressure is just social dynamics at that point, right? It's like you're always going to have a friend, right? If you ever like rent a house together, right? You always have the friend who's just like, you're like, hey, I'll do the dishes tonight. And then you're like, go back. You're like, oh, I just got to go back and grab something. You come back and they're doing it. You're like, why are you doing it? And they're like, I had to do something, right? As long as one of those people's there, and they're always there, right? You keep going forward, and people keep moving you along. And then just the goofy exploring, as people explore, they'll like, oh, I found this thing. Oh, I want to use it. Oh, here's the thing to use it on, right? And it kind of pushes you along. We had a lot of intense debate about this topic, which I think is really funny. And we have yet to have a playtest breakdown.
Right.
Where somebody, I'm sure it'll happen, but we're like a group of 4 people just goes like, has this like existential moment and goes like, wait a minute, what's the point? We don't have to do anything. But like,
wow.
But like,
maybe that's the greatest gift a game can give you. Well, actually, no, that sounds quite cynical.
I mean, it would fit with the narrative, though. The game is like this evil conglomerate corp is like controlling you. So if you just gave up on your shift, it's like, all right, that's fine. You don't, it's like minimal profit lost to them. Sorry.
You should have an achievement in there for downing tools or something, just like stand there for the whole 4 minutes, nobody touch anything.
Yeah. But you'd be surprised at how self-motivated it is with a few players, even in just like a purely cooperative game, that people, they want to accomplish something.
What is the word you guys use for like the hand finger tracking stuff?
It's hand tracking.
Tracking.
We call it like our interaction system, and it's Owlchemy's interaction. So we do all sorts of tricks that you may not have noticed there, but we'll stretch your fingers like as you pull away, so that way like your fingers are not a stable length. So if you like grab on a switch and you're not like perfectly centered on the switch and you pull your hand away, your fingers will stretch a little bit before they snap.
Right. To let the player realize that either they have a good grab.
Yeah, and it gives a little floatiness, which feels good. We do all these things where we like have these different kind of grabs. So it'll be like, oh, this is a cylindrical grab. So it's like, you can grab a clipboard on the side. You can grab it in your hand. You can grab it on the bottom like this. And so we have this whole procedural system where we can like place an object and say like, oh, this is the kind of grab that would happen at this point.
How tricky is it to communicate all of these things to players without like just completely covering the screen with this is how you use it? It has to just kind of work, right? Like that. Once you take a controller out of someone's hands and it's just their hands, they're going to use their hands the way they've used their hands since they were born, right?
So actually, everything we're doing is accounting for that, right? Is we're almost doing the opposite. It's like every time we'd be like, okay, well, we could teach them a magic gesture or put up a tutorial. It's like, no, just make it work like how it's supposed to work, right? So it's like, that's what all those grab things are about, is like, we don't want to say like, you can only grab a soda can in the middle of it like a cylinder, right? If you want to grab it on the top with the tips of your fingers, we're like, all right, you could do that because you can do that in real life. And we even do passes. We'll like go through the whole game every once in a while and just be like, all right, make sure all the grab states are right. And we'll run through it all. So a lot of what we do is we try to build it to not require it, to leverage all the knowledge that you've brought in from like living on this earth. And you go, okay, I know how to pick up a soda can. We go like, yes, you do. And then a bunch of systems in the back kick off to make it feel like you did it.
One interesting thing I saw was when you're putting your name in at the start, using the pinch instead of what you might consider on a keyboard is a tap. There must be a very smart reason why pinching is the sort of way to go about with that.
Yeah, tapping is terrible. And it's because we're all used to our keyboards, which have a tactile feedback, right? So when you push a key on a keyboard, eventually you hit a desk or a lap or something, and it presses back against you, right? Like good old physics 101. And tapping in air, you have no frame of reference or point. So that keyboard, the bubble UI we use, or squishables is what we call it, the squishable UI, it has a lot of things are actually happening. So the pinch is because your thumb does provide a haptic back to you. It's why a lot of the UI uses pinch in a lot of different operating systems that like, oh, you're like Apple, why Apple uses the pinch. Yeah. Right, and the eye tracking, it's because pinch it gives you the same haptic as the keyboard thing. Now the secret of our keyboard is not just that, the bubbles move up to you, so you don't need to hit if you want to hit a precise point in space, that's like athlete or dancer stuff, right? That's like you have such control over your proprioception in your body that you can like point at a point in space perfectly, right?
That's a good point. There's in my day-to-day, there's never a time where I have to do that, or rarely is there. Yeah, I'm
not good at it. I'm terrible at it. So what we do is when you get close, the bubble, the squishable comes and meets you halfway, and as you move around the keyboard, it meets you halfway. So it's more like all the keys are kind of floating, and as you get close to them, it kind of comes to you, and then you pinch. And it's like, it's not the fastest keyboard on earth. I'll be the first to say that, but it is by far the most accurate keyboard I've ever used in VR. Right? And that's saying something. Like, I've used a ton of these keyboards. They're never accurate. They're all bad.
I think you're wrong there. I think the most accurate keyboard in all of VR is the one in Job Simulator.
Well, that's yes. If you have 1 and 0, I thought you 1 and 0, sure. And the other most accurate is like you can Bluetooth in a keyboard, right? And then they're like, okay,
yeah, sure.
But yeah, yeah. Write everything in binary.
Exactly.
How well do you know ASCII today? So yeah, that's the bubbles, and we actually use them in other places too. So when you customize your avatar and things like that, we've just found that like not trying to get you to point at a specific spot, but like just meeting you with your intent, right? Once you get within a certain radius of this thing, we're like, okay, we got you. And we move the bubble into your hand, and then you squish to confirm. And you go like, I'm there. It works really well, and the tutorial is like 5 seconds for even the least tech-savvy people. Like, even when we don't have a tutorial and we see people going in space, we just shout, pinch! And then they never need anything else.
There are some elements of VR that seemed like technological inevitabilities, like, hey, let's get rid of these lighthouses. Let's get the cables off the headset. Let's make these things lighter. Let's make it so that you can use your own hands instead of a controller. So I get why we've gotten to that stage, but what do you think about the controllers, or the lack of controllers, of you using your hands, is the most like important part of it? Or is there any element of it that you didn't realize maybe surprised you about it?
Well, I mean, what's always surprised me is how used to it you get, right? Like, when I play a lot of Dimensional Double Shift. So when I'm not playing Dimensional Double Shift, I'm playing other VR games. And every once in a while I'm like, oh yeah, I got to pick up these controllers and I got to remember that. The thing about hand tracking that's so beyond valuable is controllers are built based on like video game controllers, right? And we were just talking about the audience. And think again about who I was saying the audience was. The audience is young kids who don't have a ton of console experience, right? Not young kids, sorry. Youth, right? Who don't have a ton of console experience. And people who are like buying this stuff who think VR is cool and maybe want to do exercise or maybe want to check it out, but not hardcore gamers. And the problem with not hardcore gamers is you're putting a blindfold on their face and then saying press X, because one controller is XY, the other is AB. And they're like, I don't even know where these buttons are, let alone X. Or you're like, use a joystick. It's like, you know, not all, like, a lot of us have been around since N64 and, you know, those kind of controllers, but a lot more people have not. And I think when you think about the actual input scheme, the actual control scheme, right, that is a huge point of friction, is to put that in somebody's hands and be like, well, you go and you grip with this button, and like we struggle with Cosmonious, with certain subset cohorts of people, right? Like people who play games, they got it, they did it. But if you were like somebody who was like, this is really interesting, I don't play games, we'd be like, press forward to teleport, and they're like, what does forward mean? And you're like, press A, and then you go into Dimensional Double Shift, and you're like, hey, pick that up, and they just pick it up. And you're like, touch that button, they just touch the button.
Like you said, there's been a lot of change in VR in the past couple of years. It sounds like the market is definitely shifting as well, continuing to grow and maybe pulling people from non-traditional gaming backgrounds, if there even is such a thing anymore. Where do you see it being in the next 5-10 years? Like, do you think Meta's investment has been worthwhile for them? Do you think Apple will continue into this space? Like, the thing about talking about VR is that there are people who have headsets that use them that seem to sort of acknowledge that this is a market and a thing, and then there are people who maybe don't have headsets who are very skeptical of this tech. It still feels like a new technology to many of us, right? Even though it's been around for over a decade at this stage. So where is it? Like, what's the health of the industry, and where do you think it's going to be in 5 years?
Yeah, I think in 5 years we're going to see a lot of growth into the space where people are using it as a general computing device, right? This is like the boring non-gaming answer, but it's true, right? I think Apple was the first step into that. What happens when you have a more infinite canvas? And I also think it's going to be interesting what happens when you can switch modalities, right? Right now, it's not as clean. I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see that become much cleaner, where you start with an app and then you make it take up most of your screen. Then you make it full screen, which is like VR. And so you're going to see a lot more moves in that general computing state, and you're going to see VR finding its core, right? And you're seeing Apple doing kind of coming to the same point that we are, which is like VR is better together, right? Because they have the whole thing where you can like pop somebody right into your session and you can chat. And so those are kind of the moves that I see it making. I also tell people to remember, right? Like, we always are judging VR on a scale of cell phones, but like our memory of phones only goes back to 2007, right? And it's like Apple had another actually Apple had two handhelds before the phone. They had another phone they made with Sony Ericsson that was like dog shit.
Oh, really?
Right? Is it? Yeah. Look it up. It's the iTunes phone, right?
There was an iTunes phone.
There was an iTunes phone that they collaborated with Sony Ericsson on. And then before that, they had the Apple Newton, right? And we had PDAs, and we had Palm, and we had all these companies, and we had BlackBerry, right? And we forget all that. And the same thing happened in games, right? Like, in my personal opinion, right, we're barely exiting the Atari stage of VR. We're still in this space where you go to the arcades and you're like, what weird control scheme will this cabinet have, right? I don't know. This one's got a trackball. This one you sit in, right? And so it's like, we're just starting to coalesce. We're just starting to understand like what joystick and button means and what all that stuff is. So I see the next 5 years as like, you're going to see a lot of growth in terms of like what these headsets are capable of, especially in terms of like pushing them further than they've been from rendering capability and those kind of things. You're going to see them get lighter. You're going to see the hand tracking get better and start to move towards more parts of your body using just the cameras and some estimation and AI magic. And then the big thing you're going to see, the real innovation you're going to see, is like people figuring out how to make software that works similarly across an entire landscape, right? Which we haven't had, because like if you want to make a 2D app for, you know, before Apple, you had to build everything yourself. But now in the Apple world, you could start to like, and other companies are following this lead, you could start to have a cohesive singular thing. Do I think it's going to replace computers? No. Do I think it's going to replace phones? No. But, you know, theater still exists. Movies didn't replace that, right? It's going to find a space in like a media landscape.
Massive thanks to Andrew for taking the time to talk to us today. Dimensional Double Shift is available now for free in early access for the MetaQuest 3S, MetaQuest 3, MetaQuest Pro, and MetaQuest 2 headsets. This was the 10th episode of Dear Dwyery and the final episode of our first season. The show will be taking a little break, and I'm hoping to bring it back in 2025 to tell more stories from the world of video games. If you have any suggestions for episode, please hit me up on socials at Danny O'Dwyer. Massive thanks to Jesse Grasher for producing this episode and every episode of Dear Dwyery in 2024. Make sure to go back on the feed and pick out any of the ones you've missed over the past couple of weeks. And until next time, see you around.